Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to echo the praise of all involved with this project, presenters, authors, and certainly those behind the creation of this really extraordinary and quite beautiful book. I hope you'll see a copy of it soon. My essay, Soul Searching, The Portrait in Gilded Age America, describes how artists in late 19th century America, a period known as the Gilded Age, sought to represent the essence or soul of a sitter in addition to capturing their likeness. While this idea might arguably be found in the portraiture of other periods, scholars in many disciplines suggest that the notion of self was in flux at this moment and began to influence diverse forms of cultural expression, a topic to which I shall return shortly. In the fine arts, critics of the period often suggested that the very best portraits went beyond appearances to reveal the sitter's unique, unseen individuality, which they frequently referred to as the soul. To give an example, from one of the most insightful critics of the period, Mariana van Rensselaer, she asserted that John Singer Sargent's portrait of the toddler Beatrice Gollett, seen here, was, quote, a pearl among pictures, not just for its compelling likeness, but because, as she said, Sargent had seen not only form and color with clearness and acuteness, but also the baby soul behind them. That Van Rensselaer could suggest that an interior life lurked beneath the surface of this little girl speaks to a profound shift in how individuality was perceived at this time. Now, I freely admit that the idea of the soul as used in my essay is subjective and difficult to define. However, I'm going to fall back on the Supreme Court's well-known attempt to define obscenity and say that I know it when I see it. So in my essay, I use these images as a comparison. Thomas Eakins' Edith Mahan, seen here, and G.P.A. Healy's Emma Cecilia Thursby in the full length. Both women were accomplished musicians, which Healy signals with the sheet music in Thursby's hand. I would argue in this case that Healy's painting of Thursby is very much a material likeness, a catalog of the physical, of hair, lace, fan, satin, and jewels. For me, Thursby is all surface, while Eakins' picture of Mahan is about the interior. Eakins indeed carefully renders the details of Mahan's physiognomy, indicating the sagging flesh of her middle-aged neck and her moist, slightly reddened eyes, but less as surface description than to elaborate on a haunting sense of loss. The physical and the psychological converge in Eakins' portrait to create a work that bears the sitter's soul to the viewer. Artists were not alone in their efforts to plumb the unseen depths of the human psyche. Life writing also changed during the later 19th century, rejecting an earlier preference for uncomplicated moral exemplars. Private life, thought, and personality became integral to biographical and autobiographical writing, leading to what Virginia Woolf would call the new biography, wherein the inner life of thoughts and emotions predominate. Not all of these texts would be written by individuals who came from privilege. Some would be notable for bringing to light the experiences of people who hadn't often had opportunities to share their stories with the public, from mill girls and farm boys to Native Americans, African Americans, and immigrants. For one consequence of the increasing significance of a person's inner life is that it opened up possibilities for who could be represented. Not that the Gilded Age offered a level playing field for visual representation, far from it, but by privileging interiority, non-elite sitters began to slip into the visual culture of the period, particularly if we take into account those that appeared outside the realm of high art in the pages of the pictorial press. One of my favorite journalistic texts from the Gilded Age is Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. Not his well-known book of the same title, but the article that preceded the book, which Rees wrote for Scribner's Magazine's Christmas issue in 1889. It's filled with some of his best-known images represented not as photographs, as you see here, which is how I learned them in art history classes, but as illustrations by some of the best-known Gilded Age painters, like Kenyon Cox, who is seen in both images here. I was frankly stunned to learn that Cox, known for his idealized visions of elite white womanhood, had also portrayed Rees's iconic image of abject poverty, Italian rag picker. Text and image do not generally work together in Rees's article, with images somewhat randomly interspersed throughout the text, without relation to what's being discussed. In the text, Rees, a progressive reformer, nonetheless offers up horribly racist caricatures of Italian, Irish, and Chinese immigrants, generally reserving his sympathies for the more skilled German and English transplants he met in New York's Lower East Side. And yet, his Italian ragpicker begs for the sympathy that Rees can't always bring himself to speak. She does the work for him, and part of that is shaped by the way that Rees self-consciously transforms her into a Renaissance Madonna. But I think that another part is located in the humanity of the sitter. I read her not as an image of the poor, but as a portrait of a woman in New York slums, as an individual. A subset of Rees's images, especially those of women and children, seem to do this, including the work that I discuss in my essay, I Scrub's Little Katie, seen here. For me, a mother of three, Katie's visage is absolutely haunting. Cognizant of the image's power, a wash illustration by Irving Ramsey Wiles of Rees's photograph of Katie appears at the beginning of his 1892 Scribner's Magazine essay, Children of the Poor, even though her story doesn't come up in the text for another 20 pages. In the 2016 retrospective of Rees's work, organized by the Museum of the City of New York and the Library of Congress, Katie's image similarly became the signature of the show. In the galleries at the Washington venue, her image was projected on a wall at life size. Seeing her at that scale gave her a presence that reminded me of the work of John Singer Sargent. Katie seemed to me like an impoverished counterpart. Oops. Little lag. An impoverished counterpart to Sargent's many portraits of children. Sargent, perhaps the most phenomenally talented portraitist of his era, was also the artist that many critics considered the most adept at capturing the souls of his sitters. In the essay, I compare Katie with one of the young privileged girls in Sargent's masterful portrait of the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. Art historians David Lubin, Erica Hirschler, Susan Sidlauskas, and others have frequently discussed the artist's uncanny ability to portray the inner lives of the girls in this painting, who are, in some instances, not even clearly seen. And I compare her to this figure here on the left. Little Katie, who at 9 years old kept house for her working siblings after the death of their parents, displays the self-possession of the Boyd girl on the left, who steadily returns the viewer's gaze. However, Katie's gravitas, shaped by loss and labor, also allow her to appear like a much older matron posing for her portrait. Indeed, when Sargent came to my mind in relation to little Katie, I think I unconsciously thought of his portrait of Isabella Stewart Gardner because of the close formal similarities of the poses of the two subjects. That Katie, in her poverty, could evoke the socialite Gardner highlights the inner strength of Katie's soul. None of this is to suggest that I believe that Rees hoped to conjure up Sargents in the minds of his audience, but that little Katie can cross this class divide because she's treated as an individual worthy of attention. A small thing, perhaps, for us today, but huge for the 1880s and 1890s when social Darwinist thinking shaped perceptions of poverty, including some of Rees's own ideas. The key conclusion that social Darwinists reached on the issue of the poor was that they were genetically deficient people who could not be helped. Indeed, some theorists, like sociologist William Graham Spencer, went so far as to suggest that it would be more humane to allow the poor to flounder and die rather than to sustain them with misguided aid. Reese, an immigrant himself, struggled with his own prejudices and sympathies to become an advocate for the poor. In particular, he focused on the environment by arguing for tenement reform. In spite of his frequent stereotyping of immigrant groups, Reese's attention to environment allowed him to escape some of the most damning and, sadly, amazingly persistent beliefs of the social Darwinists. For Reese, heredity was not all, and by depicting little Katie as a tidy, self-possessed individual, he hoped he could shake the complacency of his middle-class readership into supporting his plea for tenement reform. If poor orphaned Katie can draw you in, then the door opens to others lacking the social standing for representation in traditional portraiture, especially in the pages of pictorial journalism, but also in fiction. Anarchists, shopgirls, and immigrants became protagonists in novels of the period. A few years before Sargent painted The Boit Girls, his friend Henry James began crafting his important psychological novel, Portrait of a Lady, a work full of inner life, which was also a signal success for the author, who became intimately identified with the genre. James's tale, the story of Isabel Archer, a young woman who gains a substantial inheritance and enters into an unhappy marriage, is driven almost entirely by character. The action, as it were, comes from within. As literary scholar Michael Gora observes in his meticulous study of the book Portrait of a Novel, James understood that the actions of women, like Isabel, who occupied the same social tier as the Boit daughters, were circumscribed by their sex. In order to craft a plot driven by its socially circumscribed female character, James had to propel the story through means other than physical action. James' solution to this problem was to place the center of the subject in the woman's own consciousness. According to Gora, James believed that Isabel's adventures would lie not in the outward events of her life, but rather in her comprehension of them, in an inner drama that might, to her, seem as enthralling as any tale of pirates or caravans. James' brother, William, would help to found the school of philosophy known as pragmatism, which gave substantial weight to the role of experience in our understanding of the world. William James and his pragmatist cohort believed that ideas were only relevant insofar as they became useful to the individual. And further, that an individual's relationship to an idea can change due to experience. These ideas again push us to think beyond the surface in favor of an inner subjectivity. Such privileging of experience can also be found in the fine arts, in the emotional toll of life seen in the faces of Aiken's Edith Mahan or in that of his student George Reynolds, a Civil War veteran. It could also allow for interest in those who possess quite a different experience of the world than that of the dominant white Protestant middle-class culture. The Native American writer Zikala Zah, for example, told her own story on the pages of the Atlantic Monthly, as she reckoned with her dual heritage as the child of a Yankton Sioux mother and a white father. She describes leaving her mother and the Pine Ridge Agency Reservation as a child to attend a Quaker-run missionary school, in which she's forced to reject her Sioux heritage in order to assimilate. In her essays, she describes the inner turmoil and humiliation she experiences in this environment, where her hair is shorn, her language is forbidden, and she must wear Anglo clothes. She experiences disorientation and loneliness. As an adult in the essays, she reflects upon her education as having unmoored her from both native and white cultures. She becomes alienated from her home because of her forced assimilation, and yet she can't be anything other than Indian to white America. Her tale is harrowing and personal, suggesting a modification on the colonial captivity narrative in which the subject does not find redemption in Christian belief, but rather in her rejection of it. In spite of the account of her childhood education, Zicala also described her continuing connection to the system in which she was trained through her role as a teacher at the Carlisle Indian School and her study of the violin in Boston. Throughout her essays, she expresses extreme ambivalence about her identity as an assimilated Sioux living off the reservation. The pictorial photographer Gertrude Casimir visualized Zicala-Sa's divided self in a series of photographs she took around the time of the Atlantic essays. In some of Casimir's images, Zicala-Sa presents her Anglo identity. In these, she's dressed in a white gown, seated or standing before a light or floral backdrop. In some instances, holding the violin that she came east to study, in others, she holds a book, both symbols of intellect and culture. Another group of photos shows her in Indian dress, as if to enforce a binary contrast between the two groups of photos. Her clothing and the backdrop are dark in these works. The shift between the two sets of images in content and tone may reinforce some of the beliefs of the period, contrasting the civilized Indian with the romanticized native. Yet they also clearly relate to the divisions that Zicala-Sa described herself in her articles for The Atlantic. And in at least one image, gives a clearer sense of the tense commingling of the two cultures in its representation of Zicala-Sa in white Western gown, but with Indian accoutrements. In this image, we see a woman in two worlds. Although Casimir's photographs were never intended to accompany Zicala-Sa's text, they reveal a similar sense of agency in the sitter's desire to present her own story. These are just a few examples of the images that I discuss in my essay, which also gives great weight to primary texts. As an art historian teaching in a history department, I find myself engaging in much soul-searching of my own, as I feel somewhat conflicted about my identity as a scholar. From my perch, I can see lots of cracks between the disciplines, many of which seem like exciting and fruitful areas for exploration. But I'm also wary of operating in the cracks because their betweenness suggests a place of limbo. This has long been the promise and peril of interdisciplinarity, a term that I'm told is no longer current and has been replaced by the more accurate multidisciplinary. In any case, the risk of working in more than one discipline is that it's difficult to be truly conversant in two distinct academic areas, let alone more. I think you always end up feeling a bit more comfortable in the area of your training. That said, whether I've succeeded or not, this multidisciplinary essay was the most enjoyable piece that I've ever written, as it relates to ideas that I've been thinking about for years. I've always been drawn to life writing and have many lingering questions about its relationship to portraiture in the late 19th century, only some of which I was able to engage with here. I've also wondered about whether we can truly define portraiture in the late 19th century with any clarity. The Gilded Age witnessed an effusion of figure painting, much of it based on life study. Some models were easily recognized and even attained celebrity, begging the question, when do such images become portraits? The sculptor, Augustus St. Gaudens, repeatedly used his mistress, Davida Johnson Clark, as a model in his allegorical sculptures. For those who know his work, her recognizable face blurs the boundary between portraiture and allegory. Indeed, portraiture seems much more complex in this time than it's usually been given credit for. While some images suggest the superficiality the age is well known for, the gilding of the Gilded Age, a shallow veneer of gold, there are also depths still worthy of exploration. Thank you.